Forbidden from sleeping with men, the Agozi, the regiment of immensely fierce female warriors who fought for the kingdom of Dahomey, were recruited when young and forced to undergo the kind of military training that would turn most of us into conscientious objectors. One British traveller described how the women were forced to scramble across dense thickets of acacia thorns without anything to protect their feet from bleeding. Other tests were designed to desensitize them to the horrors of combat. Every year, new recruits of both sexes were required to mount a platform 16 feet high, pick up baskets containing bound and gagged prisoners of war, and hurl them over the parapet to a baying mob below. And in perhaps the most horribly memorable detail, a French officer called Jean Béol watched as a teenage recruit called Naniska, who had not yet killed anyone, was brought before a captured young man whose hands were bound. According to Béol, she swung her sword 3 times with both hands, then calmly cut the last flesh that attached the head to the trunk. She then squeezed the blood off her weapon and swallowed it. Nice. Now that was top historian of Africa, Dominic Sambrook.
Oh, my word.
Writing in Unheard, UNHERD. And Dominic, you were prompted to write that article.
Yeah, based on my own close research, I want to stress,
yes,
Tom.
Yes, well, that's very evident. But that was inspired by The Woman King, a film that came out last September.
Yes, the Viola Davis, John Boyega film, which is about the formidable Amazon warriors of Dahomey. At least that's how they were presented, wasn't it? So then there was a huge storm, if you remember, because Dahomey was a kingdom, an empire based partly on slavery. So there was a huge storm about whether or not these characters should be portrayed as anti-slavery freedom fighters, as they were in the film, or whether this was traducing the historical record. And lots of people on social media got really agitated and tore lumps out of each other about it. And I thought,
I'm going to wade in.
Yeah, I thought this is a great opportunity to write about my favorite subjects, which are blood and guts. So I did.
And so you took it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so this idea that, that there were regiments of what European observers at the time called Amazons, it's obviously, it's a kind of incredible detail. It seems barely plausible. But then I met Luke Pepera, who is an anthropologist, historian, a broadcaster. And Luke, you're busy writing a book, Motherland, 500,000 Years of African History, Cultures and Identity, which I think will be coming out in 2025. And you said that this theme of Amazons in Africa, that I wasn't just kind of projecting Eurocentric fantasies. Please reassure me that I wasn't, that this is something that is actually a feature of various places in Africa.
Yeah, no, definitely. Female fighting forces, soldiers, military commanders, it's something that's very much a feature of, of African societies and African cultures. Dating all the way back to, that of Kush, which, existed or was once in modern day Sudan, began in about 5000 BC, ended at about 350 AD. And there was a period from about 200 BC to about 100, 200 AD where they actually had, female rulers, the Kandankes, who also led, campaigns against the Egyptians, against the Romans. So the most famous is Amani-Renus, who in sort of 26 to 23, 22 BC, fought against the Romans, who had, just conquered Egypt, and we're also trying to annex Kush as well. What's interesting, obviously, about the Amazons in sort of the classical Mediterranean is that there's a kind of, there's almost an inbuilt fear, because the Amazons of that ilk are basically like an all-female society who don't even allow men to live in their society. It's like what would happen if all the rules of society were completely reversed? And so I'd say one thing I would say is that there's a bit more of a balance in the reality of the African societies. But you can definitely see why that attitude of Amazons, or at least the perception of Amazons, came across to the Europeans who were, or Mediterraneans, or ancient Mediterraneans, whoever, who encountered the female commanders and the female soldiers that existed in numerous African societies and cultures for 2,000 years.
So the Amazons have popped up a few times in the rest is history. Alexander the Great was supposed to have met the Amazons. We talked about, in our recent series about Columbus, about how at one point some of the instructions that he has when he goes out are see if you can find where the Amazons are. So when Europeans go to Africa, and obviously all this reflects this kind of fascination, this sort of probably quite heavily sexualized fascination with kind of nubile female warriors. And this sort of belief that it's exotic, but it's also forbidden, it's transgressive, and all of this sort of stuff. Is there any sense, I know we're massively generalizing because we're talking about different societies at different points in time, but do you think there's a sense in Africa, as there is in Europe, that female warriors are transgressive, but sort of also sexy, as it were, glamorous, or is there more of a sense that they're just mundane? They're part of, of course societies have female warriors. That's completely natural, completely normal.
Oh, that's a great question. I would say actually mundane, just because, like I said, in Africa, it tends to be, it's not just a feature, for example, of the military. It's actually a feature of all of society where you're going to have female counterparts to male positions in society. For example, in Kush, in ancient Kush, and actually, even other societies like the 9th century, Ashanti, even in Dahomey, there's basically an ideology of duology and dualism, which is essentially that in order for aspects of society to function, you need a male and female counterpart working together. And that's often reflected in the belief systems as well. Usually the main gods of, a lot of these African cultures are actually, either they're both male and female. So they're actually of two sexes, or they're of the two sexes fused into one. And it's only by, that connection, that fusion, that actually that god comes into being. So you see it even, for example, in political institutions. So in ancient Kush, from at least the 8th century BC, you, for example, have, the institution of the queen mother there is very strong. So the king rules, but the queen mother, i.e. the mother of the king, is the most important person in the kingdom, even though she's not the one actually in charge of the day-to-day operation of state. And that is the king. And kingship in Kush and in other African societies, in fact, quite a few, is elective, meaning that there's a council who decides who the best prince is, and they make him the leader. And then what happens is that his mother ends up becoming the queen mother and becomes the most powerful person, in society. But the king has quite an interesting relationship with his mother and with his wife, and all three are needed. And the wife and the mother represent the female counterpart, and the king and usually the brothers represent the male counterpart, and both are needed in order to rule the state for it to, believe to be functioning effectively. So that goes for the military as well. That goes even for the household. So it pervades all parts of society.
But Luke, there are examples, aren't there, also not just queen mothers, but of women who rule as queens, who have the rule of an entire people. And you mentioned that you have a particular favourite, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
She was the first person that you nominated when we started discussing this subject. So this is Nzinga of Ndongo.
Yes.
Have I pronounced that right?
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about her, because she is, I'm ashamed to say I'd never heard of her, but having read up on her, she really is an amazing figure.
Yeah, she's quite amazing, and really interesting, because I think she has this aspect definitely of being heroic because of what she achieved, but actually the brutality that characterized not only her time but also her rule, and things she did sometimes to her own people and also to the Portuguese who were fighting.
Yes,
makes her quite a fascinating figure. And
I mean, she's not Jacinda Ardern, is she?
No, no, definitely not.
So she's 17th century.
So she's a 17th century ruler of the Kingdom of Ndongo, which is what was once in northern Angola, what's now northern Angola. And she's actually the first female ruler of that kingdom. So women are treated, actually fairly well in that kingdom, equally in that kingdom. They're not considered property. They can divorce their husbands if they like, go back to their father's family. Even elite women, so royal women like Nzinga was. So she was part of the royal family of Ndongo, was allowed to sit in on, the meetings of her father's political councils and military councils, etc. But she was actually the first sole female ruler of that kingdom, because actually female rulers, even though there'd been female ancestresses, there wasn't actually a precedent of a woman being totally in charge of the kingdom. And so she was unique in that regard. But, she comes to power. She comes to power in the mid-17th century, but, it's really just after the Portuguese have gained quite a strong foothold in West Central Africa. First with the Kingdom of Congo, which is nearby, just northwest of Ndongo. Yeah, and then with Ndongo itself. And the Ndongan rulers of the late 15th century, early 16th century are quite keen initially to build relationships with the Portuguese, because they see Congo, was also a rival kingdom, gaining goods and power and weaponry, etc. And they want a piece of that. But then afterwards, and this being in the late 16th century, the Portuguese attempt to found a colony in Ndongo, the colony of Angola, because they're making alliances with the king. Sometimes the king, including actually Nzinga's grandfather and father, are using them to fight, rebellious nobles. But then, when the Portuguese, for example, defeat these nobles, sometimes conquering the lands, and they fall out with the kings. And then obviously they wanted to found their own colony as well, based on, because they start making, inroads deeper into West Central Africa, coming across Congo. And this puts them at odds with the rulers of Ndongo. So they fall out as well. And there's this tense and conflict-ridden period that precedes Nzinga's rule.
But she's not trained to be queen, is she? She has military training, I think, as a girl, but she doesn't.
Yeah.
Her brother is king first.
Her brother's king first. So yeah, I mean, she did have training in regard because actually she was, as the story goes, she was actually her father's favorite.
Right.
So Ngola Mbande is her father, and she's recognized as being special, as being particularly talented. I mean, she's born in the 1580s in the breech position with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck. And this is seen as being an auspicious sign. And when the Mbundu, that's the name of the inhabitants of the kingdom of Ndongo, see her being born in this position, they actually say, oh, my mother, there's a sense that she's destined for greatness.
Yeah.
So she's taken really under her father's wing. She's the best at throwing the axe, and the axe is like a symbol of Ndongan, authority, royal authority.
So her brother hates her, doesn't he? And you can see why. I mean, if you're...
Oh, yeah.
Your big sister is better at throwing an axe than you are.
Oh, yeah. No. So there's a resentment there. I mean, Angola, so what happens is Mbande Angola is actually assassinated by his own men. There's a rebellious Soba in the north called Gavulo, and, the Portuguese are also, engaging in conquering activities in the region. And, his men and his nobles basically see him as a weak figure. So what they do is they trick him they say that, their forces need help, by a river in the north where the Soba's rebelling, and they take him there, and then his own men turn on him and assassinate him. And then what happens after that is there's a power grab by Angola and Mbande, because he really wants to be king. He wants to prove himself to his father and to his people. So, I mean, he just goes on a killing spree. I mean, it's sort of like, a 17th century GTA type. He kills everybody.
But not Nzinga, not his sister.
Not Nzinga or his sisters. So he has, apart from Nzinga, he has two other sisters, Kambu and Fungi. So he doesn't kill them, but he kills Njinga's son, for example. Nzinga has a baby son with one of her male concubines.
God, imagine Christmas.
I don't know if he was invited, to be honest. I mean, there's an interesting point you raised there, because actually having, assassinated him, Nzinga goes east. She actually, exiles herself to the kingdom of Matamba. And, she's there for quite a few years. But, he assassinates his uncles and, his brothers and their sons. And I mean, he kills everybody. He sees his power. Yeah, no, he is a terrifying figure. I mean, possibly mildly psychopathic.
But am I right that he then needs Nzinga to come back and negotiate on his behalf with the Portuguese because she can speak Portuguese?
She can speak Portuguese, yeah.
So is she Christian by this point?
No, not by this point.
But she's been raised by Portuguese missionaries, so she can speak the language.
Obviously, the Portuguese were a feature of the Ndongan court, so she has exposure to that. But she's also very proud of her Mbundu heritage. So you're right, when she's in Matamba, I mean, Angola Mbande is failing miserably against the Portuguese. He wanted to keep the integrity of his kingdom, and he's just failing. Like, the Portuguese are still conquering, and the Portuguese make a deal with these group of marauding militants or former soldiers called Imbangala. They're basically like mercenaries. So the Portuguese make a deal with them, and they actually sack the capital of Ndongo, Cabasa, twice.
Okay, so that's not going well.
Not going well. So anyway, he calls back Nzinga from Matamba, not only because she's popular, but because he knows that she also, dislikes the Portuguese and wants them out of the region. And like you said, has this exposure to Portuguese culture. She's a lot more worldly than he is. Calls him back, sends him to Luanda, which is obviously now is the capital of Angola, right on the coast. And that's the Portuguese stronghold, given to them by the Congolese, actually. So that's the Portuguese stronghold. So in 1622, he sends her there to negotiate a deal, and he wants the Portuguese to, give back part of the kingdom to help him against the Imbangala. Because the Imbangala, once they've destroyed the kingdom, they just leave the Portuguese and they go back and sack it again. Like they don't take orders from anybody. So he wants their help. And actually, when you mentioned Christianity, it's as part of this negotiation. In exchange for Portuguese, support and peace, that Nzinga agrees to be baptized. She takes the name Ana de Souza and has a Catholic godmother, and is baptized as part of that. As part of that deal.
When she goes to do these negotiations, is this the Portuguese are all sitting down and they don't give her a chair? And so she orders an attendant and sits on the attendant. Is that story true?
That is true. Yeah.
That's very regal behavior.
Yeah, there's even an engraving of it, which is really interesting. You can see images, because it's definitely one of the most sort of engaging moments. But that's true. I mean, whenever the Portuguese conquered the nobles, so the nobles called sobers, whenever they conquered them and made them sign, submission pledges afterwards, and even during the pledge, they used to make them sit on the floor, whereas the Portuguese governor used to sit on this gold embroidered velvet chair. So it was to reinforce and also act as a symbol of that submission. And they tried to do the same to Nzinga because they want her to sign, the submission deal. And they don't give her a chair. And she calls over one of her female attendants to make a chair. She just sort of goes down on, her hands and knees. And Nzinga sits on her and, apparently conducts the negotiation for hours just in that position.
This is promising that she's going to be a great queen.
Oh,
I mean, this is very much the kind of behavior you want. So her brother dies and she becomes queen.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
So her brother dies, she becomes queen. She's always trying to, she engages in a policy of trying to make peace first rather than war. I mean, she's actually trying to reach out to the Portuguese, but she's very keen on not submitting to them. So she's trying to engage in deals with the Portuguese governors and, they're having none of it. So it's actually after that she initiates a rebellion against the Portuguese. She sends her messengers into all of the air, basically where the Portuguese plantations in West Central Africa. So they have people working there and tells them, her messengers tell them that, she's standing up to the Portuguese and that they need to support her. There's a period of maybe 20 or 30 years where she's essentially trying to make peace with the Portuguese, failing, then battling with them. The Portuguese are pursuing her, on different islands, on her strongholds. And, she's trying to remain one step ahead of them, trying to engage in peace. But, it's essentially, a conflict-ridden few decades against the Portuguese as she's trying to maintain the integrity of the Kingdom of Ndongo.
And then how does she get involved with, is it Kasanje?
Kasanje, yeah, the Mbangala. So as I mentioned, there's this sort of, there's this back and forth conflict. So actually, she makes a deal with Kasanje after a major loss of the Portuguese. She loses terribly to the Portuguese in the late 1620s. And, her forces have been decimated and she needs more soldiers. So she makes a deal with this Mbangala leader called Kasanje. And as part of the deal, she not only has to give up her symbols of royal authority and agree to marry him, but she also has to become an Mbangala herself. So she goes through the rituals to become an Mbangala.
And that's a colossal deal.
Big deal. Huge deal.
That's giving up her own cultural heritage to embrace that of their traditional enemies, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't consider the Mbangala to be their traditional enemies per se, but it's definitely contrary to Mbundu custom. You're totally right in that regard. I mean, the Mbangala are lawless, like, for the most part.
Right.
They live by pillaging and and some of the things that she has to do, or at least is said as she has to do in the Mbangala camp, including, a blood oath ceremony where she has to drink the blood of the Mbangala and that kind of thing, run very contrary to Mbundu customs, exactly like you say.
Just a quick question on that. So I was reading about that she drinks human blood. She has to use some sort of oil made from a slain baby or something.
Yeah, a crushed baby, one of her attendants, yeah.
Right. And is that stuff just projection and fantasy, or did that really happen?
It's so difficult to say. I mean, given the brutality of the Mbangala, I'm not, I don't know if I would rule it completely out. One thing I would say is that whether or not it was a European invention is something different. It could be a Portuguese invention, but then again, I wouldn't necessarily blame the Portuguese. It could actually be something that the Mbangala, either say themselves, because their whole thing was about to inspire fear,
right,
in peoples around the place. So it could either be from them or, it's metaphorical. They're different explanations, but it could actually be, a real thing.
Because Nzinga seems to be an absolute liberal. An absolute worst. So she goes to war with the kingdom of Matamba.
Oh, yeah.
Is that right? And she conquers them and takes the queen captive.
Yeah, Mwanga, yeah.
And so she should properly put the queen to death, but instead it's very liberal Democrat behavior. She just brands her.
Oh, Tom, that's snowflakery, isn't it? Absolute snowflakery.
Absolutely. I mean, especially this time, yeah.
Absolutely. And takes her daughters into service as her warriors.
Yes. Well, she adopts her daughter. You're right. Doesn't slay Mwanga, the queen of Matamba, brands her and sends her into exile to rule another part of the kingdom, but she dies shortly afterwards.
Snowflakery.
Yeah, snowflake. But I think it's partly because she has a reverence for royalty. I think that was actually it, to be honest.
Okay. So it's like Elizabeth I not wanting to kill Mary Queen of Scots.
Exactly. I think it's not spilling royal blood. Yeah.
So at this point, is she ruling very much as a queen, i.e. as an identifiably female monarch, or is she, doing that thing where she's ruling as a king, but she just happens to be a queen, if you know what I mean? So in other words, does she dress and behave as a man or as a woman?
That's a good question. She definitely doesn't, shy away from being feminine, in certain regards. Like she has, tons of male concubines, etc. But then there is also that behavior where she makes some of her male concubines, dress up as women and then acts as, a man. So it's part of...
Right. And her bodyguard is female. So her soldiers are female and her concubines are male. And there's kind of full-scale cross-dressing going on.
I mean, she has, like you said, close female, attendants and generals and all the rest of it. Who exactly those were, we're not sure. But she also has female concubines. But then also that wasn't unusual in terms of, women being allowed to have relationships with multiple men. and especially if they're royal women. You see it in other places as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what's happening with Kasanje, meanwhile? Because he doesn't seem the kind of guy who would necessarily be happy with his wife keeping large numbers of men dressed as women.
Yeah, with concubines. Yeah. Kasanje himself has, says he has up to like 30 sons or something.
He's a lad.
So, he's probably busy. He's probably busy himself. But that's true.
But how are they getting on? Are they still a fixture?
Yeah, there's still a alliance between them. How strong this is after the conquest of, because she's still using, in Bangala forces, she uses them to conquer Matamba. Afterwards, Kasanje also wants to found his own kingdom, actually. So he's sort of getting closer with the Portuguese. So there does seem to be a freezing of relations between them, but she's still relying on his quote unquote manpower.
And so she, going into the kind of the 1630s, she becomes more and more powerful.
Yeah.
She enters into an alliance with the Dutch. She starts supplying them with slaves.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because that goes back to that thing we were talking about at the beginning about the
Dahomey.
Yeah, the Dahomey, the warriors of Dahomey. So she is slave taking. That's a pretty established military practice, is it, for that kingdom?
Yes, but I think when it comes to Africa, obviously there's two kinds. So the slavery that's happening in Africa, i.e. the types of people that Nzinga herself has in her service, are probably better described as serfs. Now, this is not to suggest
that it's fun.
Not that it's fun, but then also that Africans aren't, enslaving people to sell them to, for example, knowing full well that they're going to be traded across the Atlantic. But actually what's happening in Africa, and the reason Nzinga is angry, for example, with the Portuguese, is because they're enslaving for largely as well free Mbundu citizens. So that's an issue.
Right.
And so by building this alliance with the Dutch, and she's got her terrifying husband as well, she's able to essentially to rebuild the power of her own people.
Yeah.
And she ends up able to essentially kind of reconstitute it and to establish peace treaty with the Portuguese. Is that right?
Yeah. But she makes an alliance with the Dutch, but the Dutch actually let her down. So this is in the 1640s, and she agrees to supply.
Oh, well.
So often the way with the Dutch, Tom. So often the way.
They form an alliance in the 1640s, and they're supposed to storm, Luanda, make it up. But then what happens is the Portuguese send reinforcements from South America, and they start bombarding because the Dutch have taken Luanda.
Oh, so this is all part of the First World War, Dominic.
Yeah.
It's Tom's theory, Luke.
The Dutch-Portuguese War, global war. Yes,
exactly. It's all part of the Dutch coming into and taking, the Atlantic trade from the Portuguese, but also in South America as well. They take, the sugar-producing regions of northeast Brazil, but
Nzinga is able to capitalize on it, basically.
Yeah, she's able to capitalize on it, but like I said, they make a deal to storm the capital, and essentially when it looks hopeless, the Dutch go ahead to Luanda and board ships and take off, whilst Nzinga is waiting, for the order, or at least, for them to make their combined assault on the capital. So then she has to, try other strategies. So what she does is, again, she does this sort of, three-pronged strategy, really. So from Matamba, which is because before she conquers Matamba, she's essentially a guerrilla. She's engaging in guerrilla warfare. She doesn't actually have a base until she captures Matamba after instigating the rebellion. But she engages, quite a lot with the Capuchin missionaries, and she writes to the Pope, and she tries to get recognized as a Christian monarch. That's one big thing that she does.
And does that work?
It does, yeah, it does. The Capuchins, because they're very keen to start missionary work in Ndongo, and they want her to give up the traditional practices, the Mbangala rites.
So her state starts to Christianize. Is that right?
Yeah. So she starts to Christianize, probably, I would say, it's obviously hard to say because obviously, like I said, she becomes baptized in the 1620s, but definitely in the 50s particularly, 1650s, 1660s, she Christianizes, but she's also launching attacks against Ndongo because the Portuguese have installed a puppet king there. Mm-hmm. So she's launching attacks against him, putting on the military pressure. She's closing the slave markets the Portuguese are relying on to supply their plantations in Brazil. And she's also trying to reach a diplomatic conclusion. So she's actually doing all of these things. That's why she's renowned as a very capable leader. Her strategic mind is unbelievable. So she's doing all these things at once in order to bring the Portuguese to the negotiating table. But at this time, they also have her sister Kambu in captivity as well. So she's keen to get her back. So they capture her, a few years before. And one of her sisters actually has been drowned by the Portuguese, also having been captured. Because she's sending letters. She's in Portuguese captivity, and she's sending letters to Nzinga via a secret spy network, telling her about Portuguese movements. and the Portuguese discover these and execute her. So only one sister remains. So one part of the reason she does this as well, especially after the Dutch failure, is to really bring the Portuguese to the negotiating table because she wants her sister back. It works at the end. All of her strategies sort of converge. The Portuguese, her military one was probably the main thing. The Overseas Council, basically tell the Portuguese governors to behave themselves. They're like, you're spending so many resources fighting this one woman, and we're losing money hand over fist. End it. They're like, please stop. So that is actually, I think it's actually her military, activities in particular, and the fact that she's open to peace that brings the Portuguese to the negotiating table in the early to mid 1660s.
So it works. Her strategy works.
It works. And they sign a deal. The Portuguese in the initial contract, because there's a bit of a back and forth between what the terms are going to be. Contracts and deals go, and the Portuguese initially want to put in the treaty that she has to supply slaves, like a tribute of slaves every year to the Portuguese king. And she asked them to take that out. Not because, not because she's like
woke.
Not because she's woke, not because she's anti-slavery per se, but because that would mean that Ndongo is a vassal, is a submitted state to the Portuguese. So she asked them to take them out, and the Portuguese do. And actually she gains back most of the original kingdom of Ndongo and is recognized as the Queen of Matamba.
But then comes to a very pathetic end. She dies of a throat infection.
Yeah, dies of a throat. But she's old. This is the thing.
But she dies in her bed, doesn't she? That's an amazing feat for a warrior queen.
She's 75. She's been fighting against the Portuguese for 60 years.
75. Wow.
That's pretty good going. That is good going.
A large part of which she's been in the field. In fact, what she says, she thanks her soldiers after the peace is effected. One of the things she said is, I'm tired. I've been doing this for 6 years. I've been in the field. I'm an old woman. I just want to live with my sister in peace.
Like Tom after a podcast. Luke.
Exactly.
What an amazing woman. And thanks so much for introducing me to her. I'm very ashamed I'd never heard of her.
Doesn't she appear in the Marquis de Sade, Tom?
Yeah, she does, I think.
He claimed that she had 50 to 60 men dressed as women in her harem. Yeah. And they had to fight to the death for the privilege and duty of spending the night with her.
Right. Okay. I don't know about the second. The first part's true.
People say that about Cleopatra and stuff as well.
Right.
But that was brilliant. So I think we can definitely notch her up as an African Amazon. Let's take a break now. And then when we come back, we'll look at the Dahomey warriors, but also we'll look at some Amazons who are very close to your heart, the Ashanti Queen mothers, because you are Ashanti, aren't you?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And the Ashanti are very much friends of the show. We did an episode on them. So when we come back, the Ashanti Queen mothers. This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money.
Tom, we often talk about how to organise our finances. I'm very conscious that I'm paying for a lot of mad subscriptions. And there's one thing that we've talked about often on this show. It's the thing that we probably hate more than any other, and it's a hidden fee. I would love to get my finances under control. There are all these things piling up on our bank statements, and I think I need to fix this problem. I need to sort this out and to stop this.
My finances are so chaotic that I need this app.
So I'll tell you what it is. It's called Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending and it helps to lower your bills so that you can grow your savings.
With Rocket Money, you can track all of your subscriptions and you can easily cancel within the app with just a few taps, saving you time, avoiding charges. And you can also set budgets and goals and get personalized insights and regular reports to track how you're doing. They will even send you real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, refunds, and even low balances. So let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
That's rocketmoney.com/ishistory. rocketmoney.com/ishistory. She might have been anywhere between 40 and 50, rather round-faced, with a small straight nose, a fine brow, and a short, broad-lipped mouth. Her skin was jet black and plump. And then you met the eyes, and in a sudden chill rush of fear, realized that all you had heard was true, and the horrors you had seen needed no further explanation. They were small and bright, and evil as a snake's, unblinking, with a depth of cruelty and malice that was terrifying. So Tom and Luke Pepera, you will of course know that comes from one of our very best sources on 19th century Africa, the papers of Sir Harry Flashman, who in the novel Flashman's Lady by George MacDonald Fraser, He pitches up at the court of Ranavalona, the mad monarch of Madagascar. A tremendous figure. We'll come to her in just a second. But Luke, you are talking us through African queens and African Amazons, African female warriors. And we were promised that you would talk about Ashanti Queen mothers, who apparently, for whom you have a tendresse, I believe.
Yes. So I'm Ashanti myself. And, this was one of the first things that I got into, especially when researching African history. And, even know of Ashanti Queen mothers of myself on my paternal grandmother's side. So very close to my heart indeed.
And so what's so unique about Ashanti Queen mothers? What makes them distinctive?
So this is Ghana, isn't it? This is the kind of great kingdom, 17th century, right the way up to the colonial period.
Exactly. So now we're looking at modern day Ghana, the Ashanti Empire, founded in the early 18th century.
And they have a golden stool, don't they? Which is
the golden stool, exactly, the symbol of the Ashanti, and an acts as the king's throne, although it's not actually allowed to. Nobody's allowed to sit on it. Always kept on its side. But Ashanti is unique. Probably not unique, I would say, but it's definitely very unusual, even in Africa, actually, for being both a matriarchal and a matrilineal society. So women rule the roost in all kinds of ways. And the Queen Mother is the most important political figure, in the Ashanti authority. So that is what's, quite unusual about it, is that we have, this one figure who has a say in so many aspects of society. And who has power unrivaled in a lot of the societies in Africa, but also of the world. And everything that an Ashanti person is connected to their mother. But the Queen Mother is the mother of the Asante Hene, the Asante King.
And so, who is the most celebrated, the most martially proficient of the Queen Mothers?
Probably Yaa Asantewaa, who fought against the British in the early, the War of the Golden Stool.
It's a great war.
It's a great war because she refused to give up the Golden Stool when it was demanded of the Ashanti by the British, and actually ends up losing in his exile to the Seychelles. But she stood up because a lot of the Ashanti kings, they actually had quite good relationships with the British. Obviously, they weren't keen to fight. And she, lambasted them and said, you weak men, and, this wouldn't happen in the time of your ancestors and all that kind of thing, and then leads a resistance against them. So she's probably...
So this is the end of the 19th century, is it?
End of the 19th century, early 20th. She's probably the best known and the most revered as well. So a lot of modern Ghanaians, including my own sister, in fact, is named after her. They're called Yaa Ajewaa, which was her name, and then Yaa Asantewaa when she obtained her title, when she became Queen Mother. And
so as the Queen Mother, do you have the power of command? Do you wield the power of life and death? Any of these kinds of things?
Immortality, true. Yeah, good question. I mean, what you most have actually. So it's a more kind of power behind the throne type situation. So the king rules. I mean, we were talking about Kush earlier. It's sort of that kind of situation. But the queen decides, has the final say on who the king is going to be. So kingship in Asante is also elective. And there's actually a council of elders, the Bususa Chiri, who decides on the next king, and the people from all matters of the spectrum in terms of being from politics or from military or wherever. But if they choose someone with whom the Queen Mother is not happy, she can veto. She's the only one who has power to veto that decision. And she's the only one who can order the Asante Hene, even in front of his counselors and his advisors, can give him instruction.
Don't tidy your bedroom.
Essentially, yeah. Essentially, she's the only one who can give him instructions. And in fact, she stands, when King is seated in council, she is to his right, just behind him. And that's so that if she's threatened in any way, a bow and arrow spear, he can actually leap in front of her to protect her. So she has incredible spiritual, symbolic and political authority, but she doesn't actually handle the day-to-day, So she, for example, she doesn't lead, let's say, for example, the army.
But she can summon them to war.
Yes, but when the king goes,
right, okay,
she's put in charge of the state.
So that qualifies her to rank as an African Amazon.
Just one question about the Ashanti. So there is obviously still the king of the Ashanti.
Yep.
So is there still a Queen Mother?
There is still a Queen Mother. Yeah.
And is she still regarded in the same with the same respect and awe as her predecessors?
Yeah, same respect, same reverence. She's not as public a figure.
Right.
So even exactly, with the kind of power she wields, but, with also Tutu II, his mother, she's very much power behind the throne. In fact, he wouldn't have become, king if not for, her authority and her say-so. But usually, I mean, it's more flexible now. Usually, like I said, it was the mother, but now it could be announced as like a senior female relative. So whether it's even exactly his mother, probably is, but none too sure.
So Queen Aunt.
Queen Aunt, yeah. Indeed.
So they all sound great, but Dominic opened this segment with a description of a perhaps possibly slightly more terrifying sounding figure.
That was actually the only bit of Flashman's Lady about her that I could read out without the podcast being cancelled immediately.
So Luke, Ranavalona, the mad monarch of Madagascar. So she's 19th century.
Yeah.
And this is a period where the British and the French are both kind of throwing their weight, expanding, moving into Africa, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And she takes a stand against this. And is her reputation as a mad monarch with eyes like snakes that convey pure evil, is this a reflection of European propaganda because they're cross with her because they're being kicked out? Or is it actually true?
Do you know what? I think it's largely a reflection. And to be honest, that's not to say that Ranavalona wasn't brutal and cruel her own way. I think she was, but a lot of the sources you have are basically 19th century London missionaries who don't agree. So I mean, there's definitely a certain perspective. And actually, one of the few sources we have from a Malagasy woman in the 1850s, there's an Austrian traveller, Ida Pfeiffer, who goes to Madagascar and she meets the Queen and she describes her in sort of a similar way to in the novel of Flashman's Lady. But actually said, she actually wasn't as bad as all that, honestly. But the fact that, she's considered, mad or having gone mad at the end of her reign, I think is an exaggeration. But she definitely wasn't, in terms of, for the ordinary mariner, it was definitely a harsh reign to be under because she was uber traditional. Well, that was the aspect, is that she wanted to, because her husband, who she gains the throne from, after he dies, Radamer, was, quite open to European and Christian influence. And she was the complete opposite. So she institutes a lot of these, and, even in some respects quite, and definitely to us today, archaic and brutal, institutions of traditional mariner society, which especially to 19th century Europeans was really quite shocking. So I think that's where that comes from.
So like what, Luke? That's what all the listeners want, I think.
Yeah. So the Tanguena, which is like a trial by ordeal. So what happens is if someone is accused of a particular crime, usually it doesn't happen often. It's usually very serious crimes like, being like treason. What happens is that they're fed a meal of rice and 3 pieces of chicken skin, and then also the kernel of the seeds of a Tanguena plant. And then they're fed lots of water in order to throw up what they've just eaten. And if they throw up all 3 of the chicken skins, they're considered innocent. But if they don't throw up any, less than 3, they're considered guilty and are put to death.
That's a very Baroque trial, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, right? But what happens is that Radamer, again, being, wanting to cozy up to the British in particular, actually takes, British arms and agrees to have them train militarily, his troops. He agrees not to use this trial on human beings and Ranavalona instead on dogs. On dogs. So he's like, all right, we'll do it on dogs. Hopefully that'll be fine for you. And Ranavalona takes it back.
So this isn't because the dogs themselves have offended. It's because the dog probably belongs
to the person or is standing in for the person. Yeah.
So you could be accused, Tom, and you have a cat, for example, Edith, Edith could stand in for you in this trial. And if she vomited up the chicken skins,
she would vomit it up. I mean, I don't want to go into details, but
she's got form.
There is no orifice she is not voiding at the moment.
Oh, right. Nice. That's happening live. Fantastic.
I'm not going to go into the details. But I mean, so if she's going around killing pets, no wonder she has an evil reputation with the British.
Well, exactly. No. She takes it back to killing humans. That's what.
Right. I mean, the thing is, the British probably are more upset about dogs being killed than humans.
Yeah. Yeah.
But she's killing Christians. Isn't that the key thing?
There's that in terms of taking back, but then it's her persecution of Christians. Like I say, just because she's uber traditionalist. So she holds these grand meetings where she tells Christians to denounce themselves. And, if you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, if they do come forward, some of them are maybe told to pay a small fine, but others are executed. When there's a Christian prophet who's come up with his own syncretic religion, mixing aspects of Christianity with, the traditional mariner religion, because he used to be a guardian priest of one of the mariner gods. He's put on trial and he's executed. She has like a spy network. She used to root out Christianity. And she launches a fair few during her reign in the 30s and the 40s, 1830s, 1840s, persecutions against Christians, which obviously doesn't sit well with Europeans. But then also, there were quite a few people who were, converting in the kingdom as well. So it's a bit of a reign of terror.
Is it true, the statistics I've read, that the population of Madagascar in her rule halved, went from 5 million to 2.5 million?
No, I don't think that's true, honestly. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration.
Oh, it's not true.
We say that, but, for example, when she's rooting out, there are some, people who are dying from not just, for example, the persecutions. I mean, sometimes up to, hundreds or even thousands of, of Christians over the course of her reign, but also, people who are dying, for example, from overwork. I mean, she initiates, for example, like a buffalo hunt later on in her reign. And, Radamer didn't believe in building roads because he thought that they'd aid the advance of an enemy army. And she, in accordance with his wishes, also didn't build proper roads. But then, she organizes for all of her nobles and their households to join her on this buffalo hunt in the 40s. And, she gets, some of her people to basically build the road as they're traversing. And, but she hadn't organized for the provisions as well. So these constructors are just dropping like flies and, being dumped into open graves, and then more are being used to some exaggeration. So I think it's from also those kinds of things.
There's a tremendous scene in the Flashman book. So have you read the Flashman book, Tom?
Years ago. So
Flashman pitches up in Madagascar. He serves as her military advisor and and concubine, actually.
Stud.
And stud. Stud is the word. And yeah. Stud. So he's constantly he's in terror of his life. And he's sort of being dragged around by her. And he has to sort of perform on cue. And he's quaking in his boots. But he does so. But there are scenes where he will have just performed with her. And then she will sort of imperiously brush him aside and go out onto the balcony. And down below, they've got lots of suspected Christians who are quaking themselves down below. And she'll point at a group of them and she'll just say, burning. And then she'll point at another group and say, boiling. And go through all this.
That's very Amazonian behavior.
That's quite funny. She did do it quite like that. Often, actually, these orders would be read by, a member of her judiciary or something. So she wasn't actually doing it herself in terms of pointing out who would be killed, but she would be giving orders for them to carry out. But I think one of the reasons maybe she would rank as an Amazon is that actually, the British and the French launch a combined attack against her and against the coast. Essentially, they're pushed back. It ends up failing. And, she then afterwards launches embargoes against the British. She says she's not going to import or export cows to the Mauritius and the French island of Réunion. And, afterwards, the merchants on those islands actually end up paying her a fine. And at the time, $15,000. That's what she demands in exchange for what she considered an insult.
Okay, so you can see why she'd have a bad rap.
Exactly.
But obviously there's a complete counter-narrative to all this, isn't there? Which would be, you could tell this whole story and you could say this is a story of heroic resistance, of leadership under tremendous, a little bit like Nzinga in the first half.
You can for sure, because there is, quite a lot of pressure. And, one thing she wants from the French, for example, is to be recognized as the Queen of Madagascar. They won't give it to her. And, the French and the British are engaging in activity in this area, military, economic, political. And because she's an uber traditionalist, when her forces defeat the British and French invasion, she's seen as being a hero amongst them. But then also there were a lot of Marina who suffered as well, especially those who adopted Christianity. The
way in which these stories about Amazons are interpreted and reinterpreted, depending on where you're standing, what your perspective is, brings us back to the topic that we began this podcast with, the Dahomey warriors. So what's your take on them? I mean, these did exist.
They did. Now, it's quite interesting because they weren't always, for instance, a fighting unit in the army, in the Dahomeyan army. They became that later on, and actually they start off as a bodyguard and a mostly ceremonial bodyguard for the king. There was a Dahomeyan custom, which I'm not sure the origins of, but there was a Dahomeyan custom that no man was allowed to sleep overnight at the king's palace. So if he wanted to have a bodyguard, he had to form them of women.
That's what he said.
Yeah. So, it has to be done. Initially, these were actually his wives. That's actually where the name, Ahosi or Agosi comes from. It literally means king's wives, or they're known as Mino, our mothers. So they're actually initially taken from the female group at the palace, at the royal palace. So it's mainly in the 18th century, they act for the most part as a bodyguard. And actually there are, reports in the traditions of Dahomey of when, for example, there were power struggles and when, different factions were fighting against each other for rule of the kingdom, or there were coups, the women protected, their king. It happened actually when Gizo, who is the woman king, the king, the king and the woman king. So when Gizo, comes to power, he comes to power via a coup. And the women of his, of the person from whom he takes the throne are said to have fought very bravely, in his defense before Gizo comes to power. So in the 18th century, obviously Giza comes about in the 19th century, but the 18th century, the Dahomeyan Amazons are very much like a ceremonial, partly militaristic bodyguard. And it's actually Giza himself, has credit for transforming them into a proper fighting unit in the army where they're used in wars against other powers.
And they are used to capture slaves and to sell slaves to European powers, is that right?
I think, the way that would be, broken down is that obviously they engage in battles with other groups in Africa. So, for example, the fights against the Yoruba, and then the majority, and this is what actually happened with the majority of enslaved people in Dahomey, especially in the 18th century under the king, for instance, Agaja, is that most of the people captives of war would be used as serfs in Dahomey. And then what was left over would then be traded to Europeans, and their fates, unknown, not really sure. But they weren't actually sent out on specific slave raiding expeditions.
Right.
But they often captured people in war who then went on to be sold as slaves, yeah.
And Luke, that description that Dominic gave us in his immortal prose that I read out at the beginning of the episode, and not in any way to impugn his status as a historian of Africa.
What?
But all that kind of stuff about the Spartan upbringing, kind of running barefoot on thorns and chopping off heads and things.
Yeah.
Is this accurate as far as we know, or is Dominic making it up?
I'm not making it up. It's from their travellers' stories, Tom. French officers and whatnot.
Right.
So, I mean...
Okay.
French officers, yeah, as part of the training regime. I mean, whether they were, as bloody is obviously to be debated, but there was obviously quite a harsh training regime because, the women, the Dahomeyan women and, the unit of female soldiers in the Dahomeyan army are reckoned by a lot of the accounts of 18th and 19th century European travelers to be a lot better fighters than the men of the army as well, better at, braver and better at using muskets. And actually there are a lot of traditions, for example, when, the Dahomeyans are fighting against, towns of the Yoruba, for instance, that when the men are pushed back, it's actually the women who go in and secure, who help them win the battle at the end. So they definitely had come through a rigorous process. There are also very few of them. I mean, they start off numbering maximum 800, and under Giza, where they're sort of institutionalized and expanded, they go to about 3,000. And, their makeup, the way they're constituted and the way they operate in the field is similar to how the main Dahomeyan army, or at least the male Dahomeyan army, also operates. So they're utilized, very much and, very effectively. They're not like a support unit or anything like that. They are very much, an important unit of the Dahomeyan army.
I suppose there's two things I would say. One is that, so for example, that French officer, Jean Bayol, who is describing the woman who kills a captured young man, she cuts his head off.
Nanisca.
I mean, it's perfectly possible, of course, that is being staged to frighten and to impress the French. That it's not necessarily the norm, but this is a big demonstration. Going back to what you said in the first half,
yeah,
people want to be thought of as fearsome and formidable and all the rest of it.
Want to be thought of as fearsome, very true. I mean, it's interesting because the weather, I don't know, possibly, I don't know about the drinking of the blood, but I mean, the Dahomeyans definitely did decapitate, because actually the heads, that was actually one of the things that you used to take to the king, and you'd be paid per head that you gave to the king.
Right.
But then again, as European reports, there are apparently reports of heads, rotting like, by the palaces of the Dahomeyan kings. But I think actually there was a system of, getting paid for giving, heads or live captives ideally, but, decapitated heads to the king, and you get paid for it. So.
Well, that was the other thing I was going to say, though, is that we can't ever quite get away from the fact that so much of this story, and indeed you could, I mean, if you were being harsh, you would say even the fact that we're doing this as a podcast is a reflection of a sort of prurient European fascination.
Yes, yeah.
And to some extent, even the success of a film like The Woman King, there's a slight folk memory of this sort of, glamorous, sexy, but also incredibly violent.
Yeah.
Do you not think that? Do you think that's fair, Luke?
I think so, but I think also sometimes a reflection of the times, I'm a big fan of world history. Whenever I read, the history even of the Crusades, or if you're reading about, the wars in Europe, World War II, I mean, you just seem that, this is just an aspect of, history either that people are fascinated by, or sometimes just the sign of, a sign of the times then. I mean, Nzinga, for example, was to a large extent a victim of circumstance. She didn't set out to engage in what she did. The Dahomeyans didn't set her. But it's true actually as well. There's a kind of fascination, but also, it was an aspect of, in the same way that, different European powers, or, in China or India, wherever, you had different groups fighting against each other. It's just that you had the, similar thing happening in Africa, especially in these brutal periods.
But you don't think the fact that they're women makes it more...
Oh, women specifically?
Yeah.
I think from the European perspective, yes. I think from an African perspective, like we were saying earlier on, it's not that unusual. but it's definitely something that's just not, and I don't think there's anything right or wrong about this per se. It's just the way that the cultures have developed. There are multiple theories put for why, Africa does have, female figures in Africa become, important in so many different aspects. And it's, related to environment, but also religion and culture. I mean, so many different explanations. But, in an African context, not seen as unusual, but definitely in a Western context, having, women, fighting in that regard. So, up in the front line and also obviously the Victorian ideals about women being held up on a pedestal and they can't do this and they have to be led up. There's a lot more cultural, weight for them not. So I think you're right. I think it is, but I think that's just simply because, and it's arbitrary, it's just simply because of the way certain societies in Africa are developed and simply the way certain societies in Europe are developed.
Well, Luke, what a fascinating tour d'horizon. And I really think you shouldn't come on any more podcasts and you should just devote yourself to finishing your book, Motherland, 500,000 Years of African History, Culture and Identity, because I cannot wait to read it.
Thank you.
And obviously when I say don't come on any more podcasts, I'm excluding Alice because it would be wonderful to have you back and talk other aspects of African history.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll be back very soon with more history, more history dope, as Reagan might have put it. Bye-bye.
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 Thanks for listening to The Rest is History. For bonus episodes, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community, please sign up at restishistorypod.com. That's restishistorypod.com.